So with so few people attending the rally, to what extent is the rise of the far right being magnified by social media? To discuss that, joined by Brendan O'Neill, the editor of Spiked Online, and Ashok Kumar, an international political economy lecturer. Hello to you both. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on Sky News this afternoon. Brendan, to you first of all, what do you think? Are we over-egging as far as the far right, the alt-right is concerned?
Completely. I think what we've seen from yesterday's pathetic gathering of white nationalists is just how completely out of proportion this whole thing has been blown. You know, for the past year or 2 years, we've been told that the Nazis are on the rise again. This is just like the 1930s. Fascism is coming back into fashion. It's complete codswallop. It's a fantasy developed by the left to give themselves a sense of self-importance. The truth on the ground is that the number of white nationalists, the number of Nazis, the number of fascists is incredibly small, and we only do them a favour when we blow their power out of proportion.
Okay. Reaction to that?
Well, I mean, I think that, if you look at the thousands of people that marched through central London supporting Tommy Robinson, who praised Andres Breivik and said that actually it would have been more palatable had it been Muslims that he massacred, and also was a former member of the BNP, and also Steve Bannon visiting, also praising Tommy Robinson, also praising Mussolini and meeting with Boris Johnson, and the Tories haven't condemned that, and Boris Johnson Steve Bannon traveling across Europe supporting far-right parties that are actually empirically on the rise, despite what Brendan might say. In Germany, the far-right is on the verge of being the main opposition, the first time since Hitler. In France, you had the far-right support the highest it's been since for 100 years. In Italy, you have a coalition government of the far-right, the first time since Mussolini. In Austria, you have a coalition government with the far right the first time since Hitler. And in Sweden, of all places, you have the highest polling in its entire history for the far right. But it's not surprising that Brendan O'Neill is saying this. He's a contrarian. 1 week he'll write an article saying that comparing white people to gammon is offensive, and the next week he'll defend the right of someone to compare people who wear niqabs to letterboxes. So it's not surprising that he's just this is a long line of just contrarian statements, frankly.
Over to you, Brendan.
Well, I wish I could repay the insult, but I don't know who you are. I think the key point I would make here is that what we can see is you are lumping together incredibly different movements, incredibly different parties, and this is part of the problem. There's a real trend on the left now to denounce anyone they disagree with as alt-right or fascist or Nazi, and it's a really dodgy way of doing politics because it's driven by this desire not to engage with people, not to talk to people, not to listen to ordinary people's concerns, but really just to write people off as being beyond the pale, not worth talking to. And the second reason it's a problem is because it really denudes those historic words, fascism and Nazi in particular, off their real meaning, off their true meaning. If you're going to call everyone from Boris Johnson to the Alternative for Deutschland to Sweden Democrats a Nazi or a fascist, then you're really just misusing that word. And I think the reason the left is doing this is because it feels completely out of touch with ordinary people. It feels that ordinary people do not share its views and in fact are quite hostile to it. And the only way it can make sense of that is by assuming that most people are latent fascists and are all a bunch of brainwashed idiots. I think there's a real intolerance and snobbery to this idea, to this fantasy that fascism is everywhere.
Most people are latent fascists, potentially, Ashok, is what you're suggesting.
I mean, I didn't use the word fascist or Nazi, but, what I said was they're the far right. If Brendan's denying that they're the far right, that would be equally absurd as to the previous statements he was making. What I was saying is that actually you have someone like Tommy Robinson, a former member of a fascist party, a whites-only party, the BNP, that's undeniable, who praised Andres Breivik, who killed 69 people, who said it would have been more palatable had they been Muslims, who's now being sort of brought to the BBC, brought to other stations, and presented as some sort of representative of the working class. Now, I think that it's a sort of logical end of identity politics, something that you're saying that this person represents some mass of the working class. I deny that. I say that actually, yes, it is the politics. It's a politics of neoliberalism, politics of the government that have actually spurred on right-wing movements. And yeah, we should organize them and we shouldn't alienate them. But we need to identify what it is. When you have thousands of people marching through central London, we have to identify what that is. Are you denying that these people are from the far right, Brendan?
I think what's happening at the moment among the left is that they are lumping together different kinds of movements. Of course, some of these people are far right. Of course, a handful of the people who gathered in Charlottesville last year were actual Nazis. They actually waved the swastika. But what's happening in contemporary discussion at the moment, particularly in contemporary left-wing commentary circles, is that everything is being lumped together as proof of the return of the far right. So the Brexit vote is held up as proof that Britain is sinking back into a 1930s kind of atmosphere. The rise of populist parties, whether they are hard right parties or actually fairly mainstream right parties, is also held up as proof that fascism in the 1930s is coming back. It's a real hysteria, in fact. It's a real hysteria. And I think the great mistake that the left has made is that it has presumed that ordinary people's ballot box revolt against the old establishment is a terrible thing and a dangerous thing and proof that everyone's gone crazy and are kind of reverting back to an old white supremacy or an old way of doing politics. The left has really missed out on what is positive about this, which is that people are confronting the old political establishments who they think no longer represented them. Of course, some people are doing that in an extreme way. Most people are doing it in a very peaceful, normal way. And the left has this tendency just to tar everyone with the same extremist brush. I think it just shows how completely out of touch they are with people's concerns.
And presumably, Hillary Clinton, Ashok, is not without guilt. I mean, she talked about racist ideology known as the alt-right, and that catapulted the alt-right into Google search engines and thus infamy.
I mean, I'm not here to defend Hillary Clinton. I think that, the comparison that Brendan makes about the 1930s, undoubtedly there was probably a Brendan O'Neill in the 1930s, no doubt saying this is alarmist. It's nothing like the 1860s when we had chattel slavery. I think that, the efficacy, what we see, 20 people showing up in D.C., thousands of counter-protesters, the efficacy of organizing counter-protests, anti-fascists, banding together and saying we're not going to let that march through our streets. So that is the importance. That is the efficacy of these tactics, rather than downplaying the importance of confronting these kinds of movements.